Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to be taking a brief look at the ongoing war in Ukraine. Now, one of the issues I've had when I've looked at putting together content on the war in Ukraine in the past is that, for example, if I were to be briefing a general, I can make broad assumptions about that general's knowledge both about Ukraine specifically and about warfare in general. However, if I am, say, doing a YouTube video on it, the level of expertise of the audience is basically going to be all over the place. So instead of going to a lot of specifics about what is happening exactly right now, what we're actually going to be doing is looking at some foundational stuff so that if I wanted to produce content in the future, that this would be a jumping off point, and also to at least give you a general idea of things to look at or things that are important. And we're going to start off with some basic geography. The country of Ukraine has an estimated area of around 603,000 square kilometers. Now, you can compare this to, say, Germany if you live in Europe, that has an area estimated to be around 357,000 square kilometers, or if you're in the United States, California has an area of 423,000 estimated square kilometers. So the country of Ukraine is quite large compared to a lot of other European countries and even most US states. It's about 86% the size of the state of Texas. Now, if you compare populations, Ukraine has 43 million, which isn't that great compared to Germany's 83 million, but it is noticeably higher than California's 39 million. So it's a relatively large country, it has a relatively large population. These are two things that I feel like gets lost in the shuffle in a lot of the conversations about Ukraine that tend to conflate it with a lot of the other Eastern European nations as though it is relatively small or has a relatively small population. That's not to say it's inherently massive with a huge population by any stretch of the imagination, but it is important to remember that you could start a drive in Ukraine, drive for 8 hours in a straight line, and still be in Ukraine. So driving a military across this and moving large formations across it does take a lot of time, even if you're not expecting any enemy opposition. And this is one thing that a lot of people are failing to account for when they're talking about the relative success or failure of both Russian and Ukrainian offensives. Ultimately, a gain of 10 kilometers if you're attacking Australia doesn't even register on the map, but if you're attacking Vatican City, you're basically invading another country at that point. So it's important to realize that all gains are going to be relative to the country in which you are fighting in. And this, of course, leads neatly into the attritional aspect of the conflict. A lot of the attritional aspects of the conflict are getting somewhat conflated as though they are significantly more important than they really are. There is no magic number in terms of weapon systems destroyed or population destroyed that will cause the war to magically end. And it's also important to remember that with the estimated population of both Ukraine and Russia, the current average casualty rates per month can be sustained by both these countries indefinitely, like for the foreseeable future. In fact, they're so easily sustainable by these countries that if you were to Thanos snap half the population of both countries out of existence, they could still sustain them for the foreseeable future. Carrying forward lessons learned by the United States when in the Vietnam War, body counts as a metric at best are wildly misleading because they're not necessarily indicative of actual military success on the ground, and at worst are counterproductive because they make it look like you're doing better than you really are, and if your opponent can demonstrate that you are in fact not, it puts you in an awkward position. And there is no better example of that than the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War, in which the North Vietnamese army, despite years of the United States Army trying to inflict large body counts, managed to launch a massive offensive across all of South Vietnam and even attack on the American embassy in Saigon. Ultimately, the Tet Offensive was the big tipping point for the Vietnam War because it showed the American public that the United States was not even close to winning, despite the Army's claims of success. For reference, North Vietnam throughout the Vietnam War had a population estimated to be around 18 million plus or minus. They suffered a total of around 2 million civilian casualties and 1 million military casualties, and they were not even close to being unable to field an effective military fighting force. So it's always important to take loss stats in terms of like personnel with a bit of a grain of salt, especially when you start dealing with large industrialized powers with large populations. And if you ever need a good reference point towards exactly how many losses a country can sustain and stay in the fight, feel free to go and check, say, World War I and World War II casualty figures versus the total population. Many nations stayed in the fight despite suffering what would be absolutely apocalyptic casualties. So Overall, any loss figures of personnel out of the Ukrainian conflict need to be taken with a grain of salt, and there's a reason why actual military organizations aren't really talking that much about Russian or Ukrainian soldiers lost, because ultimately the loss numbers simply aren't high enough to decide this conflict. Another area where you're going to see a lot of bad takes about the war in Ukraine is lack of availability of certain platforms, production of certain platforms, things of that nature. And this is one of those things that's kind of hard to pin down, because vehicles are constantly getting lost, but they're also constantly getting repaired. They're also constantly rolling off the assembly line. Same thing happens for munitions, planes, surface air missiles, etc., etc., etc. And additionally, when you start looking at the economies themselves, it gets incredibly nebulous. So, for example, Ukraine has realistically converted as much of its economy as it theoretically could to a war footing. Ultimately, an economy can't completely convert to a war footing. It's not fixed. It's not really possible. If you look at the United States economy in World War II, even as the arsenal of democracy, it still wasn't completely converted over to a war footing, because there are basic aspects of commerce that you can't drop entirely. The Russian economy, on the other hand, has seen significantly less scaling in its war economy and manufacture. Despite some fairly grandiose claims by Russian officials, estimated increase in military spending for Russian Federation has only been about 2 to 5% over the course of this war. And you might realistically think that's not a lot. And also, if Russia just amped up its spending, it could definitely outspend Ukraine and outproduce Ukraine. It could retool a bunch of factories, it could start up a bunch of new factories, hire a bunch of workers. Except that's not necessarily how it works. Number one, these are very time-consuming processes. Number two, it's important to remember when you have World War II type production levels, a lot of countries in World War II are almost existing in a vacuum. While they might receive military aid in the form of Lend-Lease from other countries, they don't have to engage in regular commerce, because regular global commerce has largely shut down. Whereas regular commerce is definitely still going on within the Russian Federation, so they have to be able to continually trade goods and services in order to maintain the strength of the ruble as a currency. Which also leads to another dodgy metric being used by the Russian Federation in terms of military spending, because more spending doesn't necessarily equal more production. To use a very simple example, if you had 5 loaves of bread, each of them cost you $3 to make, that is now $15 worth of bread. If you had 6 loaves of bread, but now they cost you $5 to make, now you have $30 worth of loaves of bread. So it's double the dollar value of loaves of bread, but it's only actually a 20% increase. So you can kind of understand how inflation makes it hard to actually gauge how much military spending is equating raw material being put on the battlefield. This of course leads to a follow-on issue with a lot of analysis in terms of shortages of various pieces of equipment. Either Ukraine is short on surface-to-air missiles, Russia short on artillery shells, whatever. The problem is there is no magic number of these pieces of equipment that will make the military unable to fight. That is simply not how it works. And there are quite a few reasons why. So number one, you have the triaging of needs. So what this means is that resources that are a priority will be sent to sectors of the front that are doing the most fighting. Other sectors of the front may get less equipment or more outdated equipment. And this is why you see the disparity between some Russian crews are getting brand new T-90Ms and other Russian crews are getting T-54s from 70 years ago. Second, it's important to remember that you can simply be a lot more selective and a lot more risk averse in terms of how you use a particular piece of equipment. So for example, if you are short on tanks, limiting local counterattacks. If you're short on artillery ammunition, limiting it to only fire missions that are a high priority. If you're short on surface-to-air missiles, limiting it to only targets that are likely to hit, etc., etc., etc. So the manner in which you use them can also artificially extend the supplies of this equipment. And of course, potential production shortages and T-54s also leads us into another discussion entirely on long-term storage and the limitation of long-term storage assets. So both Ukraine and Russia have run into this in that post-Cold War, a lot of tanks and a lot of other pieces of equipment were put into long-term storage. The problem is a tank or an artillery piece or ammunition sitting in a warehouse for decades, or sitting in an open field for decades in extreme cases, is not going to weather that terrifically well. So while you do have a lot of theoretical pieces of equipment available, the process of going through, finding what's serviceable, and getting it back up to a state where it's fightable, and then shipping it out to the troops is not exactly a short one. On top of that, the initial batch you pull from long-term storage is going to be relatively easy to repair because you can find things that are in pretty good shape. But the more you have to keep pulling from those long-term storage supplies, the more you're going to run into vehicles that need significant overhauls. And some of the vehicles are simply not going to be serviceable at all. They're going to have critical damage to electronics. They're going to have critical damage to their hull structure. You simply can't use those. They're just going to be spare parts. So the long-term storage is one of those. You get diminishing returns the longer you go into it. And it also takes time to just go through and assess what can and cannot be used. And again, both the Ukrainians with something like Leopard 1 and the Russians with things like older T-72s or whatever in storage are going through the same issue where long-term storage is a useful band-aid to cover a production gap, but it's not a long-term solution because ultimately the number of vehicles are finite, and in a few months or a year, it might start becoming a lot harder to get these platforms and find the ones that are serviceable. And we do kind of see this reflected in Russian loss characteristics. The T-90M and the BMP-3, which are vehicles that are currently in production, have remained relatively static in terms of their loss numbers, which means that there are a handful of units that have these pieces of equipment and they're getting fairly regular replacements from the factory. However, much older platforms like T-80Bs and BMP-1s are now being seen in much larger numbers and being lost in much larger numbers, which indicates that they're having to use these platforms as a band-aid for production. So while there's very little risk of the Russian Federation quote-unquote running out of tanks, they are starting to have shortages on major platforms and their production isn't quite keeping up with it. And this makes for a nice segue because Russian tank production is at least a useful metric for determining effectiveness of offensive operations, as armored vehicles are generally required for offensive operations. So the target for the Russian Federation, at least the stated target of tanks per year, is around 500. As far as I'm aware, they haven't currently hit it, but it's not impossible. However, it's important to contextualize that the average tank losses per month for the Russian Federation, and this is held pretty steady for about the last year and a half, is 120. This means that an entire year of tank production is supplying offensive operations for about 3 to 4 months plus or minus, and the rest of the year they basically just stay in place, conduct defensive operations, recover forces, possibly get new recruits and new replacements to conduct the next operation. And this really illustrates the effects of having shortages. It's not that you can't conduct operations, it's that it limits how much tempo you can maintain in terms of those operations. But of course, that's for the Russian Federation, who has a large domestic tank industry and also has a lot of long-term stores. Ukraine is in a much awkward position in that a lot of their older AFVs were sold after the fall of the Soviet Union, and additionally they don't have a huge domestic tank building industry. So Ukraine is almost entirely reliant on Western powers to conduct major offensive operations. They need things like Leopards, Bradleys, Abrams, etc., etc., etc. Otherwise, they simply don't have the capacity to conduct meaningful offensive operations. However, one thing that's important to remember for both sides is that defending is a lot easier than attacking. It requires less manpower, it requires less ammunition, it requires less armored vehicles. It is much easier to defend than it is to attack. Even if Western aid were significantly diminished to Ukraine, Ukraine could still defend for the foreseeable future with no major issues. And the same could kind of be true of Russia. Even if Russia doesn't increase its defense spending, the capacity to defend still exists and can still be done en masse. And it's also important to remember that both sides have dug in, both sides have layered defenses. Getting through the first layer is technically progress, but if the enemy is still defending the second and third layer and just built up another layer behind the third layer, so you're still going through defense in depth, you're still going to have problems making progress. So ultimately, what does this all mean? Well, to put a long story short, a victory by attrition would be very manpower intensive and very resource intensive for both powers, and it's unlikely that they would be capable of or willing to sustain it that long. Additionally, as the defenses get deeper and deeper and both sides get more and more entrenched and the ability to conduct offensive operations gets reduced, you're essentially looking at a scenario where military victory in and of itself is also kind of unlikely. So the likely outcome at this point is negotiation in some capacity. And you might be thinking, well, there's no way Russia and Ukraine will ever negotiate. But to offer some food for thought, at the end of World War II, the Japanese Empire was completely surrounded by Allied forces. They had no hope of military victory. Additionally, they were seen as being fanatical and would fight to the death. World War II ended in a conditional surrender of the Japanese Empire. Both sides came to the negotiating table. Because it turns out if your situation is bad enough or you see an opportunity that is good enough, everybody comes to the negotiating table. You can come on TV and say whatever the hell you want. It doesn't matter, not legally binding. But when you start looking at the brass tacks of exactly how many bodies and exactly how many resources it's going to take for military operations and exactly how long those military operations are going to go on, a lot of people sober up very quickly. And that concludes our video. So do you agree? Do you disagree? Feel free to drop it in the comments. If you like the video, please leave a like and subscribe. Again, I'm trying out this new kind of content and I want to see how much people really enjoy it. But that's all I have for today. Have a great day, everybody.